Day. As previously discussed, I am out of London at the moment whilst my house is being rewired, and unfortunately, this has meant that the conditions in which I'm making programs is perhaps less than optimal. Um, One consequence of this, and also of time constraints, is that my videos are going to be shorter than usual, and I can't guarantee that I'll be able to provide updates every single day. But for what it's worth, I will continue to the extent that I can to continue to provide updates and to do programs. So where are we? Briefly, over the last couple of hours, there's been information about further Russian advances on the Ukrainian battlefronts. The British Ministry of Defence has now admitted that the Russians have made significant gains in Bakhmut. In fact, it's been one of their most pessimistic reports about the war. To date, it has no real comfort for Ukraine. It carries no real comfort for Ukraine. I will read out briefly what it says. In recent days, Russian forces have regained some momentum in the Battle of Bakhmut. Since late March 2023, their advance had largely stalled. I've never taken that seriously, but then it goes on to say Russia has made further gains and has now highly likely advanced into the town centre and has seized the west bank of the Bakhmutka River. Ukraine's key 0506 supply route to the west of the town is likely severely threatened. Russian regular forces, likely include airborne troops, have probably reinforced the area, and Russia is again using artillery more effectively in the sector. There is a realistic possibility that locally Wagner and Russian MoD commanders have paused their ongoing feud and improved cooperation. Now, just to say that, as I believe is the case in the United States, there is a certain protocol in the use of language. So when the British Ministry of Defence says that Russia has made further gains and has now highly likely advanced into the town centre and has seized the west bank of the Bakhmutka River, that is a statement of fact. Highly likely means that it is all but certain. So the British Ministry of Defence says that Russia is now in control of the centre of Bakhmut and has seized the west bank of the Bakhmutka River. When the British Ministry of Defence, however, says that the key 0506 supply route to the west of the town is likely severed, that is a slightly more qualified statement. It suggests that there's still ongoing fighting in those places. Well, in fact, we can go much further than these British reports, because these British reports, this British MoD report, actually describes the situation as it was a couple of days ago. The Russians have indeed captured the centre of Bakhmut, that they captured it several days ago. They've cut off the road, or at least they're able to shell the road. I've been talking about this for a long time, based on both Russian and Ukrainian reports, and it seems that, in fact, the Russians have pushed now well beyond the centre. They've captured a string of places in the more western parts of Bakhmut. And as I discussed yesterday, it seems that the circumference of the area of Bakhmut still under Ukrainian control is around 5 kilometers, which is too small an area, I think, to be defendable, given the heavy Russian artillery use and the forces that are deployed in this area, in Bakhmut itself. So it does look as if the Russians now are making very significant gains in Bakhmut indeed. Even the British Ministry of Defence is admitting it. Now, There have been denials of the reports yesterday that the Ukrainians are pulling back from Bakhmut. And there's been more statements to that effect from Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner organization. He's come out and said that he's seen no sign that the Ukrainians are giving up the fight for Bakhmut. In my experience, Prigozhin again tends to say these sort of things, make these kind of comments, the kind of comments he's reported as making when on the eve of a Russian breakthrough. And I think a proper reading of Prigozhin's words is that yes, the Ukrainians are still defending and defending strongly in that part of Bakhmut that they control, but that area is shrinking by the day, perhaps even by the hour. I've been seeing all kinds of claims from Russian sources, especially about buildings and structures that have fallen under Russian control. I'm not able to verify them, and there's so many of them now that I can't really even begin to keep pace with all of these things. But anyway, the net effect of all of this is that it's clear that, as I said, this battle is coming to an end and that Prigozhin's forces are advancing. And it's likely that within a fairly limited amount of time now, assuming nothing changes, that the Battle of Bakhmut itself will be finally over. Now, Prigozhin says that the Ukrainians are holding firm. Others are saying otherwise. Our old friend, Lieutenant Colonel Marochko of the Lugansk militia, has told the Russian TASS news agency that Ukraine has transferred troops from the Bakhmut area to Liman because of significant advances that the Russians are making in that area. And by the way, and for the record, the Institute for the Study of War in the United States has now also apparently confirmed some Russian advances, not so much in Liman, but in the Kupiansk area, advances which the Ukrainian military themselves have not acknowledged, Russian advances that the Ukrainian military has not acknowledged, but which do seem to be taking place. And this is based on geolocation of information. And of course, Kupiansk is that important town on the Oskol River, some way north of Liman, captured just before the recapture of Liman over the course of Ukraine's Kharkov counteroffensive of the autumn. There's been fighting going on the outskirts of Liman, of Kupiansk for some time, but the Russians do seem to be making or gaining more ground around Kupiansk. And it could be that it's these advances that has obliged Ukraine to reshuffle some of its troops, to move troops from the Bakhmut area to try to hold firm in Liman and Kupiansk and that area of the battlefront. Now, someone else, another one of our regulars, Yan Gagin, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic, he's come out and said something different. He says that he also says that the Ukrainians are pulling troops out of the Bakhmut area, and he says that they are transferring them to another front, but not to the one in the north, the area around Kupiansk, but rather to the area further south, that they're now trying to hold their positions near Avdeyevka. And in fact, again, there have been multitude of reports about intense fighting in Avdeyevka, near Avdeyevka, and there was a report yesterday and early this morning, this is from Russian sources, that the Russians are now in the process of storming another important village near Avdeyevka called Pervomaiskoyev, and that if this place is captured, that will bring that moment of the final encirclement of Avdeyevka one step closer. So pressure on Ukraine are all along the lines, the front lines. Incidentally, and going back to the fighting in Bakhmut itself, though the Russians are clearly operating and attacking hard in Bakhmut, there's also reports that they're making advances in places like Bogdanovka, large village northwest of Bakhmut itself. It's basically a part of the Bakhmut conurbation area, and I suspect that this is less intended to try to encircle Ukrainian troops. I'm not sure whether such a plan ever existed, but if it did, I think the Russians have decided that it would be too costly and complicated to achieve. I think that the purpose is to strengthen Russian positions for the further advances westward once Bakhmut itself has been captured. So that's basically a quick summary of the information from the battlefronts. Now, I'm going to say a few more things about another news story that's been circulating for some hours. There's been a release of a cache of documents, NATO documents, about the conflict. And this is an interesting release of documents. I won't pretend, I haven't had the time to study these documents in any detail myself, but apparently they give casualty numbers, which apparently derive from Ukrainian sources. The casualty numbers for the numbers of Ukrainians killed, soldiers killed, is said to be much higher than what the Ukrainians have acknowledged, to the extent that they've ever provided acknowledgements. The Russian losses are said to be significantly lower. I've seen varying figures for what these documents supposedly say about these losses. The Western media is saying that that Western governments have admitted that these are real documents which have been released, that they describe the situation as it was several months ago. I'm not sure exactly when, and that they're also giving information, however, that suggests, this is what the Western media is saying, that Russian agencies have somehow tampered with these documents and have changed some of the numbers to make the Ukrainian losses higher and the Russian losses lower than they actually are. Well, I think the last is unlikely, but as I said, as I haven't actually seen these documents yet, I'm not really going to go there and discuss them in more detail in this program. What I would say is this, and again, I'm basing this on reports of what is in these documents rather than my own reading of these documents. But they do suggest that the situation with the Ukrainian military is still somewhat chaotic. And even though these documents are several weeks old, describe a situation, as I said, that's apparently several weeks old, it does suggest that Ukraine might still not be fully prepared for a counteroffensive at the moment. In other words, that counteroffensive might still be some weeks away. Well, I'm not going to say more, and everything I've just said about these documents should be taken in a very qualified sense when I've had an opportunity to read them and to make my own assessment of them. I will no doubt return to this topic. Now, on the issue of Ukraine's offensive, yesterday, as I said, there were various reports that Zelensky, based on an interview one of his aides had given to the Financial Times might be preparing for some sort of diplomatic settlement with the Russians, which would mean ceding control of Crimea to the Russians. I made it very clear that that was not my view. I did not think that this is what Zelensky himself was saying. And in fact, today there's been a statement from Alexei Danilov, who is the Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, a very powerful figure in Ukraine, and in my opinion, something of a hardliner. And Danilov is reported to have said, if someone wants to see the political suicide of our president, he can make it happen. And that relates to the possibility of negotiations with the Russians. In other words, what Danilov is saying is that if Zelensky were to enter into negotiations with the Russians, he would be committing political suicide. Now, I think at one level this is clearly intended to refute the Financial Times story, or at least to contradict the Financial Times story, or perhaps more accurately to contradict the spin some people are putting on the Financial Times story. But I think that it is also a warning to Zelensky. I think that what Danilov is telling Zelensky, and he's doing it in a very public manner, is he's telling Zelensky, if you have any idea of starting some kind of negotiation with the Russians, forget it, because you cannot remain president if you do. You will be committing political suicide if you do. Now, how does that work? Well, to my way of thinking, that looks like a threat of some kind of a coup, because how do you remove the president of Ukraine except through a coup, unless the president himself falls ill or dies or something like that happens, and or decides to go of his own volition. So it seems to me this is quite a clear threat from Danilov, who has been, as I said, who is a notable hardliner. And it makes it, I think, absolutely clear that there is not going to be any negotiation anytime soon about the future, of seeking a future, a diplomatic settlement of the conflict. The hardliners in Kiev remain very much in control. They feel they have the backing of the United States and probably Britain. For the moment, they're not prepared to countenance negotiations. The only circumstance, I think, in which they would perhaps countenance negotiations would be in the event that the Russian forces reach the Dnieper and Kiev itself becomes threatened. And then, even then, I suspect the only negotiations that they would countenance would be negotiations rather like those which happened in March last year, which so far as the hardliners are concerned, were basically an exercise in playing for time, which is of course also true about the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement, Ukraine signed it without any real intention of carrying it out, again, purely as an exercise in playing for time. So I don't personally think that negotiations are pending. I don't think Zelensky is interested in negotiations or looking to negotiate. I think his advisor gave this interview to the Financial Times. He said, look, if we succeed in this counteroffensive, we might sit down and talk with the Russians, or we might go ahead and try to attack the Crimean Peninsula ourselves. But in either case, as I said, he wasn't saying anything new, and the overall thrust of his comments seemed to me to be essentially to say that Ukraine wants the Crimean Peninsula back. It will take it either by force or if the Russians hand it over, and that's it. Neither of which I think is a realistic possibility. But there we go. Now, that brings me to the news from Beijing, because Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and Ursula von der Leyen have both just visited Beijing, and they have been there with, and they've had meetings there with Chinese President Xi Jinping. And in fact, there's been a rather amusing picture of the three, Xi Jinping, Ursula von der Leyen, and Macron, sitting at a huge round table. Xi Jinping is at the center, behind the Chinese flag, and Ursula von der Leyen and Macron are located an enormous distance from each other and an enormous distance from Xi Jinping. As a number of people have pointed out, when Macron was meeting with Putin last year in the run-up to the current spate of the fighting, there was a lot of ridicule about the fact that he was at one end of a long table from Putin. Well, this, in some respects, reproduces that format. In fact, it perhaps emphasizes the centrality of Xi Jinping, but the international media this time has hardly commented on this. Anyway, we've had a lot of information coming out about Macron's visit. Now, there's been a number of things. The first is that apparently the Chinese, polite as they always are, willing to speak and discuss matters at length, as again they always are, were nonetheless somewhat irritated by the way in which Macron apparently spoke twice as long in his one-to-one meeting with Xi Jinping as did Xi Jinping himself. And I have to say, this is, in my opinion, very characteristic of Macron. Last year, in the run-up to the war, the recent spate of the fighting, Macron had some exhaustive, prolonged, multi-hour meetings with Putin. And he came, and apparently it was he who did most of the talking. Putin was listening, and he came up with all sorts of extraordinary, abstract claims about need for a new security architecture in Europe, about all kinds of things about, avoiding conflicts and setting up settlement proposals and all of these things. And the Russians listened, and they tried to pin Macron down, and they never could. He was making, in the most general and abstract terms, sounds which the Russians perhaps liked. But when it came to offering anything concrete, he came up with nothing. And by the end of these discussions, I understand that the Russians were getting extremely exasperated, and Putin as well, Putin, who spent a huge amount of time with Macron, became frustrated and disappointed. In fact, at that famous Security Council meeting on the 21st of February 2022, the one that was heard which took place in public, and in which the Russian leadership discussed the recognition of the independence of the two breakaway republics, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, I noticed that there were comments made about the hours that Putin had spent the night before talking to Macron. And anyway, I gather that the Chinese didn't take very kindly to this either. They didn't like the way in which Macron was, as I said, talking over Xi Jinping, who was, after all, the host. And beyond that, I noticed that they were perhaps not entirely happy with some of the things that that Macron said in a joint press conference that he had with Xi Jinping. And over the course of it, I noticed that the Guardian account, the original Guardian report of this press conference, in it, Macron is spoken of as having asked the Chinese to bring the Russians to their senses, and that this is a translation of what Macron supposedly said at this press conference. Well, afterwards that was watered down, and it was said that Macron instead, this is in public mind you, with Xi Jinping by his side, said that the Chinese should work to bring the Russians to reason. Now, the last is undoubtedly what Macron did actually say, and as I said, the Guardian itself corrected its translation. But, of course, from a Chinese point of view, all of this is completely unacceptable. They would not have taken kindly to Macron talking in that way, and to Macron basically saying that the Russians are out of their senses, or at least irrational or unreasonable, or that the Chinese should be trying to win the Russians round or change them round. So what was discussed in all of these meetings between Xi Jinping and Macron and Ursula von der Leyen? Well, the Chinese and the French came out with a joint statement about peace in Ukraine. Now, this is a joint statement where Macron essentially repeats all the Chinese talking points about the fact that there should be a peaceful settlement, that nuclear weapons and all of those sort of things should not be used. It's very close to the sentiments of the Chinese 12-point position paper. Because of that, the British, at least, don't seem to be very happy with this joint statement that the French and the Chinese issued. Can I just say on that, by the way, that the British media has been by and large negative about Macron's visit to Beijing. And of course, there's been a lot of statements from the Chinese about needing to put EU-Chinese relations back on track, about China not being a party to the conflict in Ukraine. So why is the conflict in Ukraine an issue between the EU and China at all? About the mutual importance of good relations between China and the EU. A lot of that sort of thing. So I get the impression that the Chinese, in their careful way, were basically saying to the Europeans, look, we're still here, we're open for business with you as we always have been. We're not looking for a quarrel, we're not here to argue with you or fight you in any respect. Ultimately, where this relationship goes, this relationship between China and the EU, is entirely up to you. It doesn't ultimately up to us. If you decide to make Ukraine an issue between us, well, you're acting irrationally. That would be foolish. That would be borderline crazy, because we've done absolutely nothing that would merit that kind of behavior. But ultimately, we're not going to change our foreign policy. We're not going to abandon our Russian friends. We're not going to turn on them in any way. We're certainly not going to try to put pressure on them. This isn't your business. Our relations with the Russians are perfectly amicable and friendly, and we're developing a very close partnership with them. We see that as a strategic relationship between them and us. We are not here to quarrel with the Russians. If you start raising this as an issue between yourselves and us, then of course it will become an issue. But the people who will suffer most in consequence will be you. Whether the Europeans are capable of understanding this message is, of course, another matter. I rather doubt it. Actually, the fact that Macron, again, was unwise enough to hint that China would be colluding in a crime if it still aligned itself with Russia suggests strongly not. But there we go. That's where we are. And for the record, I personally think that relations between China and the EU are just going to continue to deteriorate from this point on, not necessarily because of the situation in Ukraine, but because the impetus from the United States is very much now pushing the EU itself to take an approach to China that is eventually going to lead to a deterioration in relations. So that's what I wanted to say about Macron's visit to China. I don't think it's changed anything, just as all those visits by Macron to Russia on the eve of the fighting, the breakout of the fighting in February, didn't change anything either. There has been one other very important visit which has taken place, which has attracted perhaps less attention internationally, though it is very consequential. And that is that President Lukashenko of Belarus has made another trip to Moscow, where he's had a further meeting with President Putin. And this was a long meeting, and they covered a lot of ground together, apparently. And this comes after that announcement about a week ago that the Russians were going to locate tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus, and growing information about the integration of the Belarus Air Force, which it now turns out, something I didn't know, operates Sukhoi 30 fighter bombers, advanced Russian-built fighter bombers. Anyway, all of that, the militaries of the two countries, Belarus and Russia, are now largely integrated with each other. And I get the sense that this skew of agreements that has been reached between Putin and Lukashenko are taking Belarus a further step in the direction of full economic integration with the Russians. And I have to say that at some point, going further down the line, I expect this economic integration to evolve into a position where Belarus and Russia form a single currency, based most probably on the ruble, and where there will be also political reunification in some form as well. Now, one point I would make, and it's perhaps one that people are not perhaps fully aware of, is that one of the reasons why Lukashenko, until fairly recently, was was strongly opposed to full economic integration between Belarus and Russia, was because, in my opinion, very genuinely and sincerely, he opposed many aspects of the Russian economic model. He felt it was far too neoliberal for his tastes. He supports within Belarus itself protection of these big industrial plants left over from the period of the Soviet Union, places like the giant MAZ factory, which makes enormous vehicles, used to be used by the Soviets to haul around nuclear missiles and those kind of things. Russia still imports these machines from Belarus in large quantities. Anyway, Lukashenko was very anxious to preserve these plants and which provide important employment for their workers. And he felt that too close an integration of Belarus into Russia would undermine the future of these plants and of the working class voters who are his core electoral support base. Now, the pressure of the war has caused the Russians to make major changes towards their economic in their economic model. It's become increasingly clear that these giant factories, Uralvagonzavod, the Chelyabinsk tractor factory, the Omsk factory, which used to make T-80 tanks and which was revived some years ago and refurbishes T-80 tanks, the giant Kirov works in St. Petersburg, all of these factories, still state-owned, still very much part of the Rostec umbrella, if you like. These plants, these factories, which form a core part of the Russian military-industrial complex, that the Russians are now intent on not just preserving them, but on reactivating them, reinvesting machinery and plant in them, giving more jobs for workers who operate them. In other words, the Russian economic system is starting to look more like that of Belarus. And I think from the perspective of someone like Lukashenko, that makes Russia suddenly a more attractive place than it has been up to now. It's a place which makes more sense for Russia to integrate with, for Belarus to integrate with, than was the case even a few years ago. And this, beyond the huge geopolitical shifts, the fact that Lukashenko has had to survive a color revolution attempt, all of those things, all which would have inclined him to shift towards Russia anyway. Today's Russia looks more like the model that Lukashenko would have probably liked to see fully developed in Belarus than it has looked like in the past. And I can't help but think that in some respects, and this reflects a lot of what the tone, if you like, of Lukashenko's statements, it's increasingly looking to me as if one of the reasons for his newfound enthusiasm in pursuing integration with the Russians is not just political, but because he feels that his outlook, his perspective is winning through, and that it is in fact the Russians who are coming closer to him and are, as he would see it, coming home. Anyway, we'll see how all of this works out. The big, tantalizing, unanswered question remains what happens with this Ukrainian offensive. Secretary Blinken of the United States has made it very clear that the United States is looking for this offensive to happen within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And I suspect that means it's not going to happen immediately, but as I said previously, I've no doubt that it is going to happen fairly soon. I think that too much from Ukraine's point of view, is now riding on the future of this offensive. If it fails, we will be in a completely different geopolitical place. These moves, both in China with the Europeans and with Lukashenko in Moscow, basically are telling us this. Well, this is where I'm going to finish today. As I said, I'm doing shorter videos whilst I'm away from London. I hope this is of some help. Nonetheless, as I said, it does seem as if the Russians have decided that they're going to clear up the situation in Bakhmut and probably Avdeyevka before very long. And we'll no doubt get more news about that over the next couple of hours. That's me for the day. More from me soon. And have a very good day. Just to remind you, you can find all our videos on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can find all sorts of great things like t-shirts, sweatshirts, hoodies, other rucksacks, other great things as well. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you. Again, more from me soon.